Very welcome, Julia Stenzel from the Rangjung Yeshe Institute in Kathmandu at present. You have been also teaching for a long time in McGill University in Canada. I would like to thank you for being here in behalf of the Kienzer Center of Contemplative Traditions for the University of Leipzig to get into discussion of compassion, modern and ancient, its connections and transfers as they happen in time. And maybe we can discuss a bit about your research of compassion or into compassion and the different aspects of traditional practice, how practice of compassion is perceived by traditional Buddhists, and how compassion or practice is proven to benefit Western applicants. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. So I can start a little bit with my background. The first time that I learned about concept of compassion in Buddhism was through a Tibetan teacher, Lama Gengyal Rinpoche, who you also know. And I was convinced by the way that he interacted with people. For me, that was compassion in action. Compassion for me means an intelligent way of dealing with suffering. So there we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean with suffering or pain? And what do we mean by acting in an intelligent way with it? Yeah? So Buddhists are known for having thought and written and explained a lot about suffering. That term includes a whole range from the most obvious ways of suffering, when you lose a loved one, when you have to go through difficult times, when you lose your job, when you become sick, all of that. But it includes a lot more than that. Buddhism actually talks a lot about a mental suffering that comes when faced with situations that we haven't chosen, but we cannot escape. They express it in a traditional way, facing what we are not wishing for and not achieving what we have wished for. So the whole range of mental suffering, I think, has become an important aspect also in Western societies since the pandemic. Yeah, we hear from everywhere mental suffering has increased a whole lot. Also being faced with the climate crisis, with various wars in the world. All of that has led to an increase in anxiety and mental problems. So that is a form of suffering. And then Buddhists also talk about suffering in a very subtle sense. The very fact of being alive is, in a way, suffering, because it's painful. There's nothing we can rely on. And the many Buddhist practices that exist, in a way, they're all ways of dealing with these different forms of suffering and addressing, in the very end, actually, this fundamental suffering of being. So why did I say that compassion is an intelligent way of dealing with these forms of suffering? Because first of all, they mean that as a compassionate person, I have to face myself, all these different forms of suffering, in order to be able to relate to other people's suffering. An intelligent way of dealing with it means finding ways that we can go on living in a way that becomes more meaningful, more with an open heart, more tenderness, more understanding towards others. And that is what I discovered. This Tibetan Buddhist master that I mentioned in the beginning, Lama Gengyal Rinpoche, I had the impression that he had this capacity to show others how they can make sense of these different forms of suffering they face in their lives, by showing them how these are stepping stones towards opening towards others, relating in a tender, understanding way, and therefore experience life in a fuller way than, closing up. Normally, we have this tendency of, retracting, closing ourselves when it is painful. Compassion is intelligent in the way that it shows that by closing up, we are also closing a whole lot of other possibilities of the range of human potential. Any kind of joy experience is also closed off. So compassion is a way of helping to stay open and proceed, find ways to relate to others and to grow together. And all of that I had the impression of seeing in this teacher in an embodied way, and that is why I became interested in studying the Buddhist teachings in a deeper way, and then also, of course, compassion.
Thank you. That was quite a lot in a nutshell. And yeah, I think we have different means. I mean, like if you look at the derivates from Buddhist practice, if we look at secular derivates, we have the mindfulness movement, where you basically create space beyond thoughts, where you basically might be enabled to just be in the present and not be delivered to thoughts and feelings at random. But at the same time, there has been a lot of criticism that this might lead to a dissociated state, or a state that might tend to be bare of quality and just give simple relief. And from what I understand is that a practice of compassion, even in a secular way, gives all that much more potential, gives rise to all that much more potential and possibilities of positive interacting, and also in interaction with others and with one's own inner life, that might tend to be more flourishing, more enriching, rather than enabling oneself of better dealing with the difficulties. Would you say so? Or
yeah, first of all, in the word mindfulness, there's a whole lot. I think mindfulness is an element of all Buddhist practices. Yeah, of course, the traditional meditations that we see, for example, when we go into a Tibetan Buddhist temple, is that people are reciting, people are saying mantras. We know that they are supposed to be visualizing or generating certain intentions in their minds. All of that can only be done with mindfulness as a basis, because otherwise you are distracted and you don't develop any strength, any power in your mind. Yeah. So in that sense, I think mindfulness is a good basis. And it is also the basis in the secular compassion trainings that exist nowadays. But as you were saying very early on, there was a lot of pushback against these secular mindfulness training programs, saying that Buddhism has so much more to offer than just mindfulness. Because mindfulness, in the sense of having a bare moment of awareness without any judgment, that in itself doesn't help us solve a lot of problems that we encounter in daily life. Yeah, there is much more needed. And so therefore, people like my teacher and Dr. Vater Thupten Jinpa developed programs that draw on more qualities that the Buddhist teachings have to offer, notably compassion. And so in one sense, I could also say actually compassion is just like mindfulness, contained in all and any Buddhist practice. So why focus on compassion alone? Well, interesting, if we look into Buddhist practices, even into Buddhist teachings, there isn't a whole lot of scriptures that just talk about compassion alone, because compassion...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what comes to my mind is that in the Western way of thinking, or especially in academia, we tend to dissect things and to classify things and to put things into slots, and within a living tradition, you often have a flavor that comes, but there's no single flavor. I mean, except if you have sweetener. If you have sweetener, you only have sweet. But even if you have sugar, you have flavors of sugar. And I think the same is like when you have mindfulness in the Buddhist tradition, it of course comes with the people and it comes with their view and their background. So you never have a single extracted practice without the current that they swim in, you would say, like there's a lot of other components there coming together. And that's, of course, the intention of the Center for Contemplative Traditions, also to give a view on the current rather than on the isolated aspects of practices that we tend to describe or show as if they were truly isolated, because then we can easier describe them, but they have rarely happened as such, as isolated. Sorry for interrupting you, but that's what I'm seeing, when you talk about Lama Gendin Rinpoche as a person, there was a current, there was the presence of mindfulness. At the same time, there was the strong compassion without being isolated from each other.
Yeah. Yes, I totally agree with that. One of the things that I found out in my doctoral research about compassion in Indian and Tibetan Buddhist scriptures was that you can talk about something like a compassion culture, meaning that compassion pervades all practices that we find in Buddhism. But I think there's nevertheless another aspect when we look at this recent phenomenon of having secular compassion trainings compared to the more traditional models and practices that we have in Buddhism. And that is that the secular programs singled out compassion because that was identified as actually a universal phenomenon that has nothing to do with Buddhism per se. It is contained in all major world religions, and nowadays biologists, scientists, a lot of scientists agree that compassion can be found, at least in a potential way, in all living beings. Whereas when we look into the Buddhist tradition, compassion is traditionally practiced as a triad together with loving kindness and the aspiration to achieve Buddhahood that we call bodhicitta. And so that, of course, is very much focused on a Buddhist goal. So therefore, I think it made sense that for a secular public, compassion was singled out, and a lot of research went into what this compassion is actually. Is this an emotion? Is it natural? Is it inborn? Neuroscientific studies have been made, some of which were really quite interesting. Tanja Singer from the Max Planck Institute in Berlin made a very important distinction between empathy and compassion. So all of these new findings of compassion in recent years, actually it started in the beginning of the 2000s. I think it was 2004 when brain research showed that meditators who have meditated on compassion for many years actually show different. The neuroscientific studies showed that meditation, and especially meditation on compassion, can actually be traced through neuroscientific study, and this phenomenon was called neuroplasticity, whereas up until then, the idea was that the brain builds up, and from a certain age, it only declines, and it cannot be changed in major ways. So once it was shown that meditation and also compassion meditation actually does have an influence that can be measured, then all of a sudden compassion became a scientific phenomenon that drew a lot of attention. One outcome of that was that Stanford University created this Center for Altruism and Compassion Research and Education. And my doctor, Vater Thubten Jinpa, was asked to develop a secular compassion training program that could be used to have novices be tested before they undergo the program, and they could be tested afterwards in order to be able to say something about the effects that 8 weeks of compassion training could have on a person. I think I have not totally answered your question. You may have to repeat a part of it.
Well, I don't exactly. I'm sometimes just rambling about, and picking up on things you say, and I might do your storyline no good with it in interrupting it. But what my idea was, like, I'm quite intrigued by the interaction of different practices and thought, and you could also say history of thought, all at the same time, and of the interaction of the Buddhist basic concept of bodhicitta and the aspect of general bodhicitta or relative bodhicitta and final bodhicitta, but at the same time of the connection with Buddhahood and of the connection with the idea of inborn Buddhahood as the Tathagata Garbha. At the same time, this also being put into practice and used as a practice. I mean, when we look at the Buddhist practice of compassion, we do have like an intersection of so many things, and that for me is always very interesting, looking how many currents intersect at the same time and give a stream of practice that is not singular. I do understand fully the need of singling out different aspects to make them work in other contexts, but that makes it also so interesting to see maybe how much compassion practice also in the secular context is then intersecting with other streams of thought or with other streams of practice. Like with mindfulness practice, again, you have a combination that also has been taught in traditional Buddhism, for example. Yeah.
First of all, I think that compassion training has to be composed of a lot of different elements, because compassion itself is understood as a complex that integrates cognitive, empathetic, affective, intentional, and motivational elements. And so there's something speaking to all of these different elements. A foundation that both the secular and the Buddhist training share is that there is a foundation in us human beings. So it is not that we are creating compassion out of nothing. The Buddhists talk about Buddha nature that is inherent in all beings, and that allows actually not even to develop it, but actually to reveal it rather than cultivate it. In the secular programs, we talk about research that shows that the capacity to care for others is already present in toddlers, even in babies. It's present in all animal species. So there is an element that doesn't need to be invented. It's already there. However, it is covered often by fear or by other intentions of self-defense, self-protection, and so on. And that is why what we actually see in the world is that compassion isn't the most prominent feature when we look around. Yeah, we always wish to have more in ourselves, but also see it in others. So therefore, this idea of training compassion. So as I said, if compassion is composed of these different elements, then all of them have to be either revealed or have to be strengthened. So the first element is what we could call the cognitive or the empathetic element. Cognitive here just means that we are able to see when there is suffering. always going back to the idea that compassion is a response to suffering with the wish to help and alleviate the suffering. Yeah, that is the basic definition of compassion. So the first element is to be able to see suffering, and there mindfulness comes in. Yeah, if we are distracted or if we do not pay attention, then we don't even notice when somebody else suffers. Sometimes we don't even notice when we are hurting. Yeah, we feel unwell, we might latch out, but we are not really aware of what is going on. There, mindfulness is really important to be able to look into the mind and understand what's going on. Then the second aspect is the affective or emotional aspect. And that means being able to resonate with somebody who suffers, yeah? Being able to understand through this resonance. Sometimes there is a confusion with compassion and this aspect alone, yeah? Because empathy, for example, in the medical field, yeah, a lot of doctors, healthcare providers, and so on say the suffering that I'm facing in daily work life is just too much, so therefore I have to shield myself, because there is the danger of being emotionally overwhelmed by the suffering of others. You might have heard about compassion fatigue. And the research by Tanya Singer, for example, shows that what is actually happening is not a compassion fatigue, it's actually an empathy fatigue, because there is a limit to how much suffering we can bear witnessing in others. However, what research has shown is that if you understand compassion in a larger sense, meaning the next step, this intentional step of wanting to help, wanting to alleviate, that is an aspiration, and that is never hurting. That is actually giving strength. That is sometimes acknowledging that there's a limit to what I can help right now, but in my mind, I can always wish for that person to be happy. I can always wish in the future to be in the position of helping more effectively. And this kind of wishing is something that actually even helps ourselves. Yeah, it's strangely enough, yeah, it makes you feel hopeful, because the problem with facing too much suffering is that we feel helpless, and that is hard to bear. But having confidence in the power of wishing and aspirations, that is something that is inexhaustible. Yeah. So now I already talked about the third element, which is this intentional element. And coming back to your question, this idea of how different elements play together, you know that in Buddhist practices, a large amount of what we do in, for example, liturgical practice are wishing prayers, aspirational prayers. Traditionally, Buddhists use prayers that have been written by masters centuries ago. Some people do that. Some people pray in the Tibetan language, some in translation, some just do it mentally. In any case, this power of the mind, of imagining solutions, wishing for solutions, placing good intentions, as soon as you wake up in the morning, all of those practices exist in very many different forms. And so those have been kind of distilled and integrated into these secular compassion trainings. And then there comes, of course, also a behavioral aspect, which also entails a lot of discussion, because the question is then, what is compassionate behavior? And there's no recipe for it. Yeah, we might think of compassionate behavior as, you know, running about and helping or doing charity and so on. And that is all true. But sometimes a compassionate response is not to act. In Buddhist thinking, the most compassionate action is to go, maybe not the most, for some, a compassionate action is to go to retreat and meditate, where you would think, well, what does that benefit society or anybody? Maybe not in the first place, but we have examples of meditators who have spent most of their life in meditation and who influence, even 1,000 years later, today, influence people to wanting to better themselves, to become decent human beings, to behave in ethical ways. These meditators 1,000 years influence practitioners today in ways that are much more effective than, I don't know, anybody who gave a big charity. Yeah. So when we talk about compassionate action, then, you know, there's a lot of debate what can be called compassionate action.
Well, I think very easily in our society, we might overlook that our understanding of turning towards others and of compassion is simply very much impregnated by Christian thought, where helping others and doing things to help others to alleviate their suffering directly is the norm, you know, and something which is not that pronounced in the Buddhist tradition. It's one way, but like in the Buddhist tradition, you always have the thought that, well, freeing yourself from suffering enables you of leading others to the same spot. So this also gives the possibility of becoming the agent oneself, which is not so much a Christian thought. There's more like being the tool, or being, because the primary agent then being God, being another instance that Buddhism doesn't really provide. And also this sheds a light on the way thinking about compassion might lead to its implication. But also, I think in certain ways, when you said there's compassion fatigue, it leads to, like, it's a job, and sometimes the job is too much. You know, sometimes the job brings too much suffering. You're left, often in these jobs, as I've seen, you're left without any tool to cope or to discuss and to see where you're at. And there are no programs in German medical care, as far as I know. There's spiritual care, which can be an overarching project, but it's very rarely implied, and especially not implied upon people who work in the medical field. The fatigue might set in also because there are no tools provided to deal with it. You're often left alone. It's same most likely in a situation where there's a strong suffering in the family, where you have constant exposure, but no means to deal with it at all. You don't get a break, but at the same time, you don't get the means to digest or to uplift your state of mind and to see things in a new way.
Yeah, those are lots of interesting points that you touched upon. Maybe first of all, one step back. Yeah, when I said that among certain people there's an agreement that compassion is something natural, we might ask, okay, then why do we even need to train it? So there, my answer would be the natural compassion that we have and that we also get educated in is always a compassion that is limited to what we could call an in-group. Yeah, either it is about our family and friends, or the people of our religion, of our club, of our political view. There's this idea that, of course, we would help somebody in distress or in suffering and so on. In contrast to that, the intention in Buddhist training, and I don't want to say now that it doesn't exist in other religions, but I'll just talk about the Buddhist approach. So there, the approach is to break out of this in-group and enlarge compassion to include all living beings. And that is something that needs training because it doesn't come naturally. Yeah, because it includes people that normally we ignore, people who annoy us, might hurt us, and so on. So in order to convince ourselves that that would be a good idea to wanting to help these people, that needs convincing, and that needs training. And the training that is offered in Buddhism is quite structured. And therefore, I think that the reason why now we have these secular compassion training programs based mainly on Buddhist techniques is because they have developed over centuries these very progressive and detailed techniques that have proven to be successful. And by analyzing what is going on in these trainings, in these meditations, we can see different elements. And I would call them a combination of analytical, constructive, and deconstructive methods. Analytical just means reflections about why it is a good idea to develop compassion. For example, realizing that in some sense, all beings, we share the same lot. We all have to deal with unpleasant situations, impermanence, pain, and we would like to get out of it. And in that sense, we are all equal. Yeah. No matter where we live on this planet, whether we are rich or poor, there is a fundamental struggle that we all share. And that can be taken as a foundation to wanting to help by understanding that in some sense, we are all part of one great body of humanity. Just like, well, the Indian philosopher Shantideva, yeah, he gives this example of the foot hurting. When you stepped into a thorn and your foot hurts, your hand wouldn't say, oh, that's not my problem, yeah, and not bother with it. The hand would, of course, take out the thorn and know that since we are one body, the hand also benefits from helping the foot. In the same way, if humans understand themselves as being one big family, and actually not only humans, also animals, all beings, if that awareness is there, then the idea of helping one another comes much more naturally. Yeah. So that has to do with an understanding of the interconnectedness of beings. So that would all be part of this analytical part where we just need to think and reflect about the reality in which we live. And then these two other elements are the constructive elements about how to strengthen this core of compassion and loving kindness, strengthen it, making it bigger. There are methods and meditations for that. And then there are meditations that deconstruct whatever hinders us from being compassionate. And I find the second aspect actually quite interesting because normally we don't talk so much about it. Yeah, we think immediately of charity, helping others, and all of that, which is, of course, necessary and is definitely compassion. But when I was reflecting on, so what hinders us sometimes in being open and wanting to help, all these things that hinder us, of course, that can have many different reasons. Fear is one, yeah, fear that I become weak if I am too helpful. I become poor if I give everything away. But there are also more subtle hindrances, and that is actually this thinking of in-group and out-group, for example. That is, a big hindrance is any kind of disgust, dislike, yeah, because obviously if I dislike somebody, then my inclination to help is just reduced to a minimum or not present, yeah. So there again, mindfulness helps us to analyze how we are thinking. Yeah, if there are groups in society that trigger dislike, disgust, aversion, obviously that is a hindrance to compassion, and therefore it is important to deal with these kind of concepts and worldview with which we are living in order to really let out the compassion that is as a potential in us. Well, you were also talking about the problem of having little compassion when you are actually in an environment of healthcare, caring for others, that is actually a profession defined by caring and compassion. I was recently in a seminar called Medicine and Compassion, led by Paktok Rinpoche here nearby in Boda, in Nepal, where I am. And the audience consisted mainly of doctors, healthcare providers, nurses, and so on. And they were talking quite openly about the limitations of living out and even enhancing their compassion in their work life. For me, interesting was to hear that they felt the problem was not so much the compassion towards the patients, because that came with the profession, but often they felt that there was a lack of compassionate behavior among the crew in the hospital due to the pressure and all kinds of other conditions. And that was, for many of them, actually the motivation to come to a seminar on medicine on compassion with this Buddhist background. So I think there's a lot to be done there. And well, if you like, we can also talk a little bit more about the concrete methods that exist, but I know it is going on forever. It's
yeah, but it's just like we get into it, we discuss for some time, and then we see where we get, and that's all good, you know. I mean, of course, I do have quite a good insight in the medical profession due to my wife being a medical doctor, and I see the difficulties, and I see also overarching, I see so much good heart and good motivation. Of course, it's also a systemic problem, and whatever you do when you have a systemic problem, you're thrown back to yourself. I think even that's a point when such trainings can provide immeasurable benefit, because if you don't have any help from the outside, or if your system itself doesn't support you or your crew and doesn't support the crew's interaction with itself to support each other, then you're basically anyhow thrown back to yourself. And there are always two ways. One is like opening and dealing with it. The other is numbing yourself, because when the pain is too strong, to numb yourself is kind of the basic reaction, the basic thought of protection. And I think we can connect this to the basic Buddhist idea of the self. And the cherishing of the self is a way of numbing yourself, like of not interacting, of shutting down, and of becoming isolated, which in the Buddhist terms is duality. Practice of compassion, I mean, active compassion is to reaching out from subject to object and to lower the defense and to weaken the boundary, whereas numbing yourself, isolating yourself becomes a building up of the boundary and a seeming relief, because being all oneself and being well defined. Problem is, in general, it doesn't really work that well. It's not a proven solution. Yeah, given that the more isolated you become as a human being, the more you will get into depression, the more you become entangled in simply also in thoughts. It doesn't have to be clinical depression, but one becomes more alone, and it doesn't seem to be the solution. So compassion programs work with this paradox of like, being well doesn't necessarily mean being just yourself without anything around, extending towards the outside. So that's a thing I can see. Parallel I can see in the medical profession, where when you're too much with yourself and trying to protect, it doesn't ultimately work in protecting from suffering. It works only in becoming shut off, but it still is an exhausting process. So I think for everyone, medical or non-medical, but the process is kind of universal. Remedy given by practices based in compassion training, Buddhist or non-Buddhist, seems to be the solution to an overarching problem.
Yeah. the most well-known techniques in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition for training compassion progressively aim at what you were describing, yeah? Some sense of dissolution of the boundary between self and other, in not a negative sense, yeah? It's not that we become kind of wacky, but in the sense of feeling this interconnectedness between oneself and all living beings, all life around. And I think at the bottom of this approach is the awareness that when there's openness, when there's not holding back, many qualities in the mind arise automatically. A sense of relaxation, a sense of freedom, a sense of love and compassion for others. The methods that lead to such a result, maybe some of you have heard about them. In the Tibetan term, it is called Tonglen, or giving and taking. Sometimes it's also connected to this practice of exchanging self and other. At the basis of these kinds of meditations, there's always this idea of decentering our attention away from our own pain and opening up to a greater reality. For example, the fact that pain is a universal problem. It's universally shared. And by realizing that the pain that I'm living myself is shared by so and so many other beings in the world, and opening up to that relieves our own just by taking away the attention on myself. Yeah, I think that is what you were describing in what you said. And then, of course, it also goes further, that after recognizing that I have to live through something painful, a lot of all other beings have to live through something painful, and then combining that with the wish that we find relief from suffering, that we find meaning and joy in life in different ways, and by repeating this aspiration. Sometimes it says to combine it with the breath. Each time we breathe out, sending this wish into the world. Those are very simple but effective methods of, holding on to something when we feel overwhelmed, for example. And of course, it only works if we have been training it in a lot of situations where we weren't overwhelmed. Yeah, as it is said, yeah, one doesn't learn swimming in the storm. So therefore, the meditation is often very simple, just these aspirations of sending out goodness to all beings in the world, breathing in and relieving beings from their pain and suffering, and doing that in a very regular and relaxed way. It becomes like a second nature. And when that is the case, I think in a lot of situations where normally we would feel overwhelmed, then there is this presence of mind of just, going into this mode of opening up, keeping open, and kind of holding the energy of pain or pain and joy together, without this idea of closing in on ourselves.
Yeah, it's actually quite opposite to what you would normally do. If I say, oh, I don't feel well, I get myself a big bag of chips, I stuff myself, and I kind of switch on the TV or any kind of movie and just like blow my senses. The same as like, in general, the idea is, I think, to absorb everything I think is positive, if it's distraction or whatever. And then this training you describe as the giving and taking, it's actually inversing that, giving the positive and taking the negative. And this is kind of really revolutionary in a way, as that's not the normal thing one would do. If I say, oh, I'm overburdened, my initial reaction is like, I need to get something nice for myself, get rid of the bad stuff. Like often you have like in how you call them, shall I say esoteric or what what other word can we find? Meditation systems where you breathe out the negative and you breathe in the light and fill yourself with beauty in order to fill the void. Mm-hmm. And what we have in giving and taking practice seems to be the utter opposite, seeing that within the void there's still a lot to give. Mm-hmm. And that there is no need to stuff the void with all kinds of stuff just to not feel it.
Yeah. I think I would not totally agree that normally we don't do it, but we do it with people that we love. Yeah. When you love somebody, and parents with their children, there this idea of wanting to take away their pain comes naturally. Yeah. But again, it is just reserved for a special few. And the idea that you could extend that and do it for people, strangers, that, of course, that doesn't come easily. There are some convincing necessary that actually the first beneficiary of meditating on compassion in such a way are we ourselves, because the closing down, the wanting to protect is something that first of all hurts ourselves, and being able to, stay open, being able to give is actually something that makes us happy. Here I live in Bauda, in Nepal. There are lots of beggars on the street. It is kind of part of the culture here that at least on the full moon and the new moon day, big amount of beggars come from their beggar camps. They sit around the stupa, and the local population comes and they see it not as insulting that there are all these people who want something from you, but as an opportunity to be able to give. And you can change your money into small coins or small, how do you call that? I forgot. So.
Like in India, the paisa is like really almost tiny fraction of a value that you get. Like,
well, I was thinking of bills. Nowadays there are coins, but they're hardly used anymore. Anyway, so they change it against small bills and then distribute small amounts to about hundreds of people who are sitting there. And so it is a situation created to express goodness. And why do people do that and give? Because it gives something to themselves. Yeah, being able to give, being able to help is something that makes us happy. I think everybody has experienced that. Yeah, so it is not only the receiver who benefits, it's also the giver who benefits. And when you are in the position of being able to help, I mean, what a joy that is. Yeah, I'm sure it is a motivation for those who become doctors, that there is some sense of meaning and of joy that you can help, you can heal others. And we've all known it in some situations. So I think there's sometimes just a little change of thinking necessary to see that situations in which we can be generous, in which we can be grateful, are those that make us happy. Yeah? It's not diminishing when you give away.
Yeah, that's a common thought. I mean, like, we tend to calculate, I got this much to give, and if I don't keep it, it's all gone. Within Buddhist, you anyhow have the idea of transcendence and the idea of this life not being the last one. So you have, like, you would say, a transcendent economy you're using also. So you're not emptying your pockets ultimately, but you're kind of, I think the Buddhist idea is very much that you have a karmic pocket that you still, or a karmic account that you're still paying the alms into, which might come in. But also the Christian tradition, I heard, alms giving was a lot more prevalent in the time when events after this life were discussed more drastically. Alms giving has decreased at the same time when the purpose has become more focused in the success of the present life. I heard this recently from a study, and I found this very compelling that generosity has such a deep connection to the view upon the value of life and the view upon achieving of happiness within the present life.
I would doubt that, well, I don't know what everybody has as an intention when they are giving. If it is in view of bettering your afterlife, I think definitely there is also something happening right in the moment of the giving that is compelling to practice generosity. But you were also talking about something even larger. In the Buddhist framework of compassion, of course, there is actually a greater compassion that is aimed at, that is called Mahakaruna in Sanskrit, or actually it's called great compassion. And that is a compassion that is inseparable from a wisdom that understands this philosophy of emptiness that you also talked about before. And so there, compassion in some sense is also seen, the practice of compassion in some sense is seen as a means to realize this enlightened mind. In which way? The enlightened mind means that there are no boundaries, that it's completely open, and by this repeated action of giving away, there is the movement of opening up is trained. And the Mahakaruna is described as actually a state of mind, a realization of emptiness, a realization of the complete interconnection, interdependence of not only all beings, but also all things in the world. And living in this kind of complete altruism is seen as the way the Buddhas live and act, which means a total openness that is not hindered by any negative emotions, any boundaries, and is just responding to the needs of whoever comes to you. And in some sense, that might sound utopian, but if we think of it, it's actually quite a beautiful idea. Yeah, if you're able to be of help to anybody who asks you, and with help I mean just be of benefit for them to find a more meaningful life, be more peaceful, be less destructive towards others, that would be a wonderful role that we could play in this world, wouldn't it?
Yeah, yeah. We've spent quite a lot of details around compassion, compassionate training, and I think we close for now this discussion. And thank you so much for providing also such detailed and very structured presentation. I think this is a wonderful podcast for the listeners to get into so many aspects of compassion, Buddhist and non-Buddhist. And yes, that was it for today, dear listeners. Thank you for listening to our podcast of the No Dharma Drama podcast of the Leipzig Center of Contemplative Traditions. And see you in the next one. Bye-bye.